A Chinese startup just quietly rolled out an AI model that some engineers are calling the biggest release of the year. Western media barely covered it. Wall Street shrugged. And that, right there, might be the most interesting part of this story. 18 months ago, this same company crashed the NASDAQ, wiped out roughly $600 billion of Nvidia's market cap in a single day, and forced every AI lab on Earth to explain why they were spending billions of dollars on something a small team in Hangzhou had apparently just done for a fraction of the cost. That company is DeepSeek, and they just did it again, except this time, almost nobody panicked. So is this actually a bigger deal than the moment that shook the entire industry? Or is the market just numb to it now? Let's get into it. Quick rewind for anyone who wasn't paying attention in January of last year. DeepSeek released a reasoning model called R1. It matched the top American models on math, coding, and logic benchmarks. It was open source, meaning anyone could download the weights and run it themselves. And DeepSeek claimed they trained it for a fraction of what companies like OpenAI and Anthropic were spending on comparable systems. Overnight, the entire premise behind the AI boom got questioned. If a lab with a fraction of the compute budget could get frontier-level results, why were American companies burning tens of billions of dollars on data centers and chips? Nvidia investors did not like that question. The stock cratered in a single session, one of the largest one-day losses of value for any company in history at that point. That moment got a name. People started calling it a DeepSeek moment, shorthand for the instant everyone realized the AI race wasn't a guaranteed American monopoly. Now fast forward to this year. DeepSeek didn't just sit on that reputation. They kept shipping. A new version, V3.2, landed at the end of last year and quietly beat some benchmarks against the leading American frontier models. Nobody blinked. Then, in April, DeepSeek dropped a preview of their next flagship, V4, split into two variants, a larger one called Pro and a faster, cheaper one called Flash. Both are mixture of experts models, which is a fancy way of saying the model has a huge number of specialized subnetworks inside it, but only activates a small slice of them for any given task. Pro reportedly carries somewhere around 1.6 trillion total parameters, but only activates roughly 49 billion of them per token. Flash is leaner, around 280 billion total, with about 13 billion active. That efficiency trick is the entire DeepSeek playbook in one sentence. Build something enormous on paper, but design it so it only ever uses a sliver of its own brain at once, which keeps the compute bill low. Both models ship with a 1 million token context window. For context, that's roughly the length of several full novels stuffed into a single prompt, and the model is expected to actually track what's happening across all of it. That's made possible in part by something DeepSeek published just before the launch, a new memory architecture they call Engram. The pitch behind Engram is that traditional transformer models force facts and reasoning to live in the same layers, which gets computationally messy the longer your context gets. Engram tries to separate static knowledge retrieval from active reasoning, so the model can pull up a fact from a million tokens back without dragging down the reasoning process happening in real time. Whether that holds up at scale is still being tested by outside researchers, but on paper, it's one of the more genuinely novel architectural ideas to come out of the open-source AI world this year. And here's the part that should actually worry people more than the raw benchmark numbers. DeepSeek didn't just build a bigger model. They built one that runs natively on Huawei's domestic AI chips. Huawei confirmed their latest Ascend compute cluster supports V4 directly. That matters because Chinese AI labs have been locked out of Nvidia's most advanced chips for years under U.S. export restrictions. If DeepSeek can train and serve a frontier-class model on homegrown silicon, that's not just a product story, that's a supply chain story. It suggests the technology gap the export controls were designed to protect might be closing faster on the hardware side than anyone in Washington wants to admit. Let's talk pricing, because this is where DeepSeek has always played dirty in the best possible way. The preview launched in April, and DeepSeek just confirmed the official, non-preview release lands in the middle of July, timed conveniently to coincide with a broader rollout across the Chinese tech ecosystem. The twist this time is peak and off-peak API pricing. During business hours in Beijing, roughly 9 to noon and 2 to 6, API calls cost double the off-peak rate. It's the same logic power companies use for electricity demand, applied to token generation. It's a small detail, but it tells you something bigger. DeepSeek is now optimizing for scale and infrastructure load the way a mature cloud provider does, not the way a scrappy research lab does. This is not a side project anymore. This is a company planning for millions of concurrent users. So why didn't the market freak out this time? A few reasons, and this is the actual story underneath the story. First, investors have already priced in the reality that Chinese open source models are competitive and cheap. That surprise only works once. Second, and this is the more interesting shift, DeepSeek isn't just competing with American labs anymore. They're competing with a growing bench of domestic Chinese rivals. Alibaba has its Qwen line, which is reportedly getting folded into products as far away as Apple's own AI stack. ByteDance has its own frontier models, and a startup called Zhipu, now operating under the name Z.ai, released a model this year that analysts compared favorably to Anthropic's enterprise offerings, at a fraction of the cost per token. China's AI industry didn't just catch up to the West, it multiplied internally into roughly 10 serious labs, plus a cluster of aggressive startups, all undercutting each other on price. DeepSeek's V4 isn't just aimed at GPT or Gemini or Claude anymore. It's aimed at Qwen. It's aimed at Zhipu. It's aimed at its own countrymen. And there's a financial angle that puts all of this in perspective. DeepSeek's founder, Liang Wenfeng, has reportedly seen his personal fortune climb into the tens of billions of dollars as the company's valuation has ballooned. There are also reports the company may be preparing a mainland stock listing sometime this year. Think about that for a second. A company that was, less than 2 years ago, a relatively obscure quant trading offshoot experimenting with AI on the side, may be on a path toward one of the biggest tech IPOs to come out of China in years. All right, before we go further, if you're finding this breakdown useful, take 2 seconds and hit subscribe. This channel exists to cut through the noise on AI news and actually explain why something matters instead of just repeating a headline. And if that's useful to you, subscribing genuinely helps this reach more people who need the same signal. Okay, back to it. Now let's zoom out, because the real question isn't, is V4 impressive? It obviously is. The real question is whether this is actually the biggest AI release of the year, or whether we've just entered an era where releases like this are simply expected, and that expectation itself is the story. Compare this to what happened in January of last year. Back then, the shock was existential. It made people question the entire economic logic of the American AI buildout. This time, DeepSeek released a frontier-class open-weight model with a 1 million token context window and a novel memory architecture running on domestic chips that bypass American export restrictions entirely, and the reaction from most of the West was a shrug. One equity analyst summed it up well. This release doesn't have the shock value of R1 because the market has already absorbed the idea that Chinese labs can compete. But absorbing that idea doesn't make it less true. It just makes it less newsworthy, which is a very different thing. Here's the uncomfortable framing nobody wants to say out loud. The original DeepSeek moment was scary because it was a surprise. This release might actually be more significant precisely because it isn't a surprise anymore. It's a pattern. Efficient, open-weight, aggressively priced frontier models are no longer an anomaly coming out of China. They're a production line. R1, then V3, then V3.2, then V4 preview, and now the official V4 release. All within about 18 months, each one narrowing the gap with the best proprietary systems in the West, while running on cheaper hardware and, increasingly, domestic chips that don't depend on Nvidia at all. That's not a single dramatic headline, that's a trend line. And trend lines are usually the things that actually reshape industries, long after everyone stopped paying attention to the individual data points. So does this change anything for Nvidia, for OpenAI, for the rest of the American AI stack? In the short term, probably not dramatically. Demand for frontier compute in the US hasn't slowed down, and enterprise customers still care about reliability, support, and data governance in ways that favor established Western providers. But longer term, every one of these releases chips away at a core assumption the entire AI industry has been built on: that frontier-level intelligence requires frontier-level spending. If that assumption keeps eroding, release after release, the economics of the entire AI buildout, the trillion-dollar data center bets, the GPU order books stretching years into the future, all of it starts to look a little less obviously justified. Whether or not V4 turns out to be the single biggest AI release of the year is honestly a less interesting question than the one it raises, which is, at what point does another impressive Chinese open source model stop being news and start just being the baseline everyone in the industry has to build against? Because based on the last 18 months, that point might already be behind us. So here's what I actually want to know from you. Do you think releases like this still move the needle, or has the market genuinely priced in Chinese AI competitiveness for good? Drop your take in the comments. I read every one of them, and I'll pin the best argument on either side. See you in the next one.